Good evening. I'm Jeff Bennett. Amna Nawaz is on assignment. On the NewsHour tonight,
things can get better. We should never forget that.
in his final speech at the UN General Assembly as president, Joe Biden implores fellow world leaders to work together toward peace in the Middle East and Ukraine. Federal lawmakers grilled the company behind popular weight loss drugs, questioning why patients in the U.S. pay much more than other countries for the same products. And more Americans are becoming caregivers for veterans. The former Secretary of Veterans Affairs on what's creating the need and the burden it puts on families.
The need for caregiving has exploded. Unfortunately, a lot of the last war was injuries that dealt with brain injury. Mental health is something we know the least about.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us.
the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Kathy and Paul Anderson, and Camilla and George Smith.
The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, fostering informed and engaged communities. More at kf.org.
And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. It is a tense night in Lebanon and northern Israel after the second day in a row of major Israeli airstrikes. Israel said it killed a senior Hezbollah commander in Beirut, while the militant group launched missiles at Israeli military and civilian sites. The U.S. is trying to de-escalate, including in meetings at the United Nations General Assembly, where President Biden spoke today. Nick Schifrin has more.
In Beirut today, the sound of sirens after an Israeli airstrike hit a residential building, leaving debris in the street. Damaged cars, and Lebanese authorities said 6 dead and 15 wounded. Israel said the target was a senior Hezbollah commander. Down the coast, Lebanese stood in what used to be their homes after bombings crushed the village of Akabia. To the east, in the Bekaa Valley, residential buildings turned to rubble. And in southern Lebanon, the strikes continue. Israel says its targets are hidden Hezbollah weapons, but this week's victims include children like Musab al-Mala and his mother Aziza Ali Obeid.
My children and I were at home, working and relying on God for support when the Israeli enemy hit us. They are just children.
The strikes have caused tens of thousands to flee their homes to cities that can't cope.
No doubt that the circumstances we are facing today are extraordinary with the aggression we are witnessing.
But Hezbollah continues its own aggression, including on this Israeli highway. Hezbollah has fired thousands of rockets into Israel, today hitting this supermarket in the Arab Israeli city of Tamra.
Luckily, there were no physical injuries, but there have been victims of trauma in the city.
Hezbollah is part of Lebanon's government and offers social services. But today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Hezbollah and its leader must be removed.
Nasrallah is leading you to the brink of the abyss. He is endangering your country. Rid yourselves from the grip of Hezbollah.
7,000 miles away, President Biden again called for de-escalation.
Full-scale war is not in anyone's interest. Even if the situation has escalated, a diplomatic solution is still possible.
U.S. officials are trying to use the UN General Assembly to prevent all-out war. But a senior State Department official argues airstrikes designed to push Hezbollah to negotiate will lead to escalation.
Today is the fourth time I've had the great honor of speaking to this assembly as President of the United States. It'll be my last.
Today was President Biden's UN swan song, his final speech to the international community after a half-century career often focused on foreign affairs with a worldview defined by international collaboration and a hope that served as today's bookends.
I entered public life not out of despair, but out of optimism. Things can get better. We should never forget that.
Biden acknowledged the wars that shadow this year's assembly. Gaza.
Bring the hostages home and secure security for Israel and Gaza free of Hamas' grip. Ease the suffering in Gaza and end this war.
Sudan.
The world needs to stop arming the generals, to speak with one voice and tell them, stop tearing your country apart, stop blocking aid to the Sudanese people, end this war now.
And as Volodymyr Zelensky listened and Russia's UN ambassador texted, Ukraine.
And we will not let up on our support for Ukraine. Not until Ukraine wins a just and durable peace in the UN Charter.
But despite no near-term solutions to any of those wars, Biden's final message, change can come.
Some things are more important than staying in power. It's your people. Every age faces its challenges. I saw it as a young man. I see it today. But we are stronger than we think. We're stronger together than alone. And what the people call impossible is just an illusion.
But the fact is, U.S. influence to end the war in Sudan appears to be limited. Ukraine is struggling to hold the line. And Israel has so far resisted U.S. efforts for a ceasefire in Gaza or to avoid escalation in Lebanon. So as President Biden finished his final address to the international community, Secretary General Antonio Guterres here had a much more sober look at the world. He said, quote, "Our world is heading off the rails."
Well, Nick, tell us more about how the U.S. is trying to de-escalate tensions between Israel and Lebanon.
U.S. officials, Jeff, are tight-lipped about exactly what they're doing, but they say they have, quote, concrete steps they're discussing with allies and partners. And the diplomatic deal that is on the table remains, a deal that would move Hezbollah back, as demanded by Security Council Resolution 1701, back about 6 miles from the Israel-Lebanon border behind the Litani River. That's the diplomatic deal that exists still on the table. And Israel wants Hezbollah to de-link its attacks on Israel from the war in Gaza. Hassan Nasrallah, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, has been clear that their attacks will continue so long as the war in Gaza continues. U.S. officials I speak to say that Hezbollah has taken a military hit over the last week, but they don't quite understand how that translates into the strategic gain that Israel is hoping for, returning 60,000 residents to their homes in northern Israel. And last week's attacks on Hezbollah pagers really hit Hezbollah where they are most vulnerable, Jeff, and that means that Hezbollah is much more likely to escalate than choose diplomacy.
Another major focus, as we saw in your report, is Ukraine. What more is being said at the UN about that war?
The Security Council called a last-minute session this afternoon on Ukraine, during which President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke to foreign ministers and said, look, with so much focus on the Middle East, don't forget about Ukraine. Secretary of State Antony Blinken focused on support given to Russia by North Korea and Iran. But this is an incredibly important trip for Zelensky coming to the United States this week, because he will present what he calls his peace plan to President Biden, as well as former President Trump and Vice President Harris this week in Washington. But the fact is, Jeff, that peace plan, according to Andrei Yermak,
Zelensky's top aide last night, requires 1, membership in NATO, something that the U.S. and Europe do not support, 2, permission to use long-range weapons, permission that the U.S. has not yet granted, and 3, authorization to use Russian frozen assets to pay for the war in Ukraine. Jeff, the U.S. has not given that permission either.
An important trip for Zelensky, as you say. Also an important trip, Nick, for Iran's new president. What did he have to say today?
Yeah, Masoud Pezeshkian has been presenting himself as someone who can do business with the West and someone who wants to return to the 2015 nuclear deal known as the JCPOA, which promised Iran sanctions relief in return for freezing its nuclear program. And he reiterated that statement today in the General Assembly, as heard through an interpreter.
We are ready to engage with JCPOA participants if JCPOA commitments are implemented fully and in good faith. Dialogue on other issues can follow. The appropriate response to this message from Iran is not to impose more sanctions, but to fulfill existing obligations to remove sanctions, benefiting the Iranian people, hence laying the foundations for more constructive agreements.
But this week, senior Biden administration officials have said that Iran has made too much progress in terms of its nuclear file since the Trump administration withdrew from JCPOA. And they also expect to see behavior change by Iran. That includes not supporting proxies around the region and not sending weapons to Russia for its war in Ukraine before any negotiations can happen. And Jeff, there's no sign that Iran is interested in making either of those changes.
Nick Schifrin in New York tonight, reporting from the UN General Assembly. Nick, thanks as always. We start the day's other headlines with the presidential campaign. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are touting their plans to boost the economy, as Harris also tries to keep the focus on abortion rights, an issue that Democrats see as a winning one, with 41 days to go until Election Day.
Thank you. And hello, Savannah, and hello, Georgia. We love Georgia.
Campaigning in Savannah, Georgia, former President Donald Trump today sought to outline his economic plan.
This new American industrialism will create millions and millions of jobs, massively raise wages for American workers, and make the United States into a manufacturing powerhouse.
Mr. Trump unveiling a proposal, he says, is aimed at offering new incentives to lure foreign companies to the U.S., promising lower taxes, energy costs, and fewer regulations.
With the vision I'm outlining today, not only will we stop our businesses from leaving for foreign lands, but under my leadership, we're going to take other countries' jobs. Did you ever hear that expression before? Have you ever heard? That we're going to take other countries' jobs? It's never been stated before.
A new Quinnipiac poll out today shows Mr. Trump leading Vice President Kamala Harris 52 to 45% with likely voters when it comes to handling the economy. But several other recent national polls show Harris is narrowing that trust gap, with her plan focused on lowering costs for middle-class families. While campaigning in Wisconsin this week, she spoke to Wisconsin Public Radio about her affordable housing plan.
I understand and have as part of my lived experience a lifetime practically of being a renter, and also what it means for families to aspire to own a home.
The vice president outlining her proposal that she says would incentivize developers to build 3 million new homes while providing $25,000 in down payment assistance to first-time homebuyers. She also discussed reproductive rights, saying she supports ending the Senate filibuster to restore Roe v. Wade to protect abortion rights nationally.
We should eliminate the filibuster for Roe to actually put back in law the protections for reproductive freedom.
Later this week, Vice President Harris will head to the U.S.-Mexico border for the first time since becoming the Democratic nominee. It's part of her swing through the Sun Belt states, Arizona and Nevada, where immigration remains a top issue. Also today in the Middle East, Palestinian officials say Israeli airstrikes killed at least 24 people across Gaza. In Khan Yunis, a boy mourned his father, who was one of at least 7 people killed there. 15 others were injured, including women and children. Meantime, world leaders at the UN General Assembly blasted Israel for its military operation in Gaza. The Emir of Qatar, a leading party in ceasefire talks, called Israel's actions a crime of genocide. The King of Jordan said the scale of death and destruction is beyond justification.
So is it any wonder that many are questioning how can this war not be perceived as deliberately targeting the Palestinians? The level of civilian suffering cannot be written off as unavoidable collateral.
For his part, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to address the assembly later this week. At least 2 people have died after what was Hurricane John slammed into Mexico's southern Pacific coast overnight. It rapidly strengthened into a Category 3 storm, making landfall with maximum sustained winds of 120 miles per hour. It's since been downgraded to a tropical storm. John is expected to hover over Mexico through the end of the week, bringing torrential downpours, flooding, and landslides. Meantime, Tropical Storm Helene is gaining strength in the Caribbean. It's expected to make its way north, hitting Florida as a hurricane as soon as Thursday. Residents there have been filling sandbags to brace against potential flooding. Florida's governor has declared a state of emergency ahead of the storm's arrival. Maryland is suing the owner and operator of the Dali cargo ship that caused the Baltimore bridge collapse earlier this year. It's the latest in a series of legal troubles for the companies, which have denied any wrongdoing. Today's lawsuit is seeking damages related to cleanup costs and rebuilding the bridge, among other expenses. Maryland's Attorney General said that the state's residents should not have to foot the bill for the disaster.
The Dali was not fit to sail that morning. The day before the collision, its electrical system had failed twice. Failures that the ship owners and operator could have and should have fixed to avoid the tragedy.
6 construction workers were killed in the collapse, and trade in the port of Baltimore was held up for weeks. The U.S. government is suing Visa, saying the financial services giant unfairly stifles competition in the debit card market. In particular, the Justice Department alleges that Visa penalizes merchants and banks who don't use the company's own payment processing systems. According to the DOJ's complaint, 60% of debit transactions in the country run on Visa's debit network. That leads to more than $7 billion in fees each year. It's the latest Biden administration effort to crack down on corporate middlemen, following similar efforts against Ticketmaster parent Live Nation and real estate company RealPage. In a statement, Visa called the lawsuit meritless and said the company will defend itself vigorously. On Wall Street today, stocks posted a second day this week of modest gains and new records. The Dow Jones Industrial Average gained more than 80 points on the day. The Nasdaq added 100 points, or about 0.5%. The S&P 500 notched a new record closing high. And retired NFL Hall of Famer Brett Favre told a congressional committee today that he's recently been diagnosed with Parkinson's, a degenerative neurological disease. Favre was on Capitol Hill for a separate reason, to testify about welfare abuses in his home state of Mississippi and to address allegations that he and others misused millions of dollars to build an athletic facility. Favre revealed his diagnosis when talking about a biotech company with ties to the welfare case.
Sadly, I also lost an investment in a company that I believed was developing a breakthrough concussion drug I thought would help others. And I'm sure you'll understand why it's too late for me, because I've recently been diagnosed with Parkinson's. This is also a cause dear to my heart.
Favre played 20 years in the NFL, mostly for the Green Bay Packers. He did not say whether his Parkinson's diagnosis is connected to his time playing football. Also on Capitol Hill today, the man in black, Johnny Cash, became the first musician to ever be honored with a statue in the U.S. Capitol.
Because you're mine, I walk the line.
The U.S. Air Force Band paid homage to Cash with a rendition of his legendary hit, I Walk the Line. And with help from sister Joanne Cash and daughter Roseanne, Cash's bronze statue was unveiled in the Capitol's Emancipation Hall. Created by sculptor Kevin Cressy from Cash's native Arkansas, The statue depicts Cash with his guitar slung behind his back and a Bible in his hand. Johnny Cash is one of few artists inducted into both the Country Music Hall of Fame and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Still to come on the NewsHour, the head of the U.S. aid agency, Samantha Power, discusses foreign assistance in a time of global turmoil. Author Wright Thompson takes a closer look at the people and forces behind the murder of Emmett Till. And rock legend Nick Lowe releases his first full-length album in over a decade.
This is the PBS NewsHour from the David M. Rubenstein Studio at WETA in Washington, and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
Ozempic and Wegovy are some of the most popular drugs in the country, driven by their remarkable success treating diabetes and obesity. But the drugs are extremely expensive, and the drug maker's CEO appeared on Capitol Hill today to face questions about why those prices are so high. William Brangham reports.
What we are dealing with today is not just an issue of economics.
At a Senate Health Committee hearing, Chairman Bernie Sanders, independent of Vermont, pressed the CEO of Novo Nordisk about why Americans pay so much more for the same drugs compared to other nations.
The net price for Ozempic is still nearly $600, over 9 times as much as it costs in Germany. And the estimated net price of Wegovy is over $800, nearly 4.5 times as much as it costs in Denmark.
CEO Lars Jorgensen defended his Danish firm, pointing the finger for high costs principally at the U.S. healthcare system.
We don't decide the price for patients. That's set by the insurance companies.
He specifically blamed what are known as pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs. They act as third-party middlemen between drug companies on one side and insurers, pharmacies, and hospitals on the other, often determining which drugs get covered and at what prices.
Insurance companies and their PBMs, the big conglomerate, have more than doubled, actually close to tripled their profit.
Jorgensen argued those prices are high because Novo Nordisk has to pay the PBMs rebates to ensure his drugs are covered. More expensive drugs lead to higher rebates. But Sanders said he'd received pledges from major PBMs that would change that equation.
We have in writing, we will certainly share it with you, commitments from the 3 major PBMs that if you substantially lower your list price, they would not limit coverage. Will you work with this committee and the PBMs?
If it works in a way where patients get access to a more affordable medicine.
Republican Roger Marshall of Kansas echoed the point that PBMs should be the focus.
Novo Nordisk is not the villain in this story. They're a hero. We should be here celebrating this miracle innovation.
Fellow Republican Bill Cassidy of Louisiana.
We still have to preserve the profit incentive for the creativity for drug companies to invest in order to develop the drugs that are going to positively affect the burden of disease in our society. That is the tension.
The hearing comes at the same time a new government study finds that in the last 10 years, the U.S. obesity rate remained largely unchanged at about 40%, and that severe obesity rose slightly in the last decade.
And we talk about the cost of the medicine, but it's really the cost of the diseases that's breaking the system.
Jorgensen told senators that the price of Ozempic and Wegovy pales in comparison to the hundreds of billions that diabetes and obesity cost the U.S. every year.
These are very, very expensive diseases, and we talk about the cost of the medicine, but typically in these diseases, the cost of the medicine is less than 10% of the total disease burden.
Experts predict that one or both drugs may be involved in the next round of Medicare price negotiations. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm William Brangham.
The U.S. Agency for International Development is engaged in humanitarian work across many of the conflict zones around the world, from Gaza to Ukraine, Sudan, and beyond. Nearly 300 million people in the world are in need of humanitarian assistance. The agency's work is crucial in getting that help to the most vulnerable, despite challenges of access and violence. Amna Nawaz sat down earlier this afternoon with the administrator of USAID, Samantha Power, in New York, where world leaders have gathered for the UN General Assembly.
Administrator Power, welcome back to the NewsHour. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to begin with some news today, and that is specifically out of a ProPublica report just today that they're saying that in the spring of this year, USAID submitted a report to the State Department that included an assessment that said Israel was blocking aid into Gaza, specifically medical and food aid. You know that would trigger the U.S. stopping weapons supply to Israel. Can you confirm that you sent that report, and if so, what happened to it?
Well, I think we have made very plain our desire to see as much aid as possible flow into Gaza, our concerns about a lot of the roadblocks that have been put in the way. I'm not going to comment on any report from today, from a long time ago, beyond to say that our focus is as laser sharp on that set of issues around access as the number of trucks flowing in today is not sufficient.
If I may, because the report is not just alleging that there are roadblocks, as you have lamented before, it's difficult to get aid in. They are alleging that Israel was deliberately blocking aid. In your assessment, have they been, at any point in this war, deliberately blocking aid?
Again, there needs to be improvement, and particularly in advance of winter. There also needs to be improvement, needless to say, in terms of civilian protection. Almost every day it feels like we wake up to a report of an internally displaced person camp or a school or a medical facility being subjected to fire. It's extremely challenging to fight in an environment where Hamas is deliberately using civilians as effectively human shields. But the responsibility, again, on every professional military is to fight in a manner that minimizes the harm to civilians.
As we speak here today, of course, the conflict seems to be expanding as well. There have been some leaders who are expressing concern about the way in which Israel is now waging war in Lebanon. The UNICEF chief said yesterday that reports of 24 children in Lebanon, among the hundreds dead, and she urged people to adhere to international humanitarian law. Can you offer your assessment of the way in which Israel is waging this war? Are they adhering to international law?
Watching the risk of escalation and expansion of a conflict that has already displaced tens of thousands of people on the Israeli side, on the Lebanese side, on top of the crisis we were just talking about in Gaza, with all of the human consequences of that, it would be catastrophic. And so all of our diplomacy, again, is invested in trying to contain this conflict. That is what this week at the UN is about, is pressing the parties to make sure that cooler heads prevail, because if you need a reminder of what conflict looks like, look at the human consequences in Gaza. You know, the fate of the hostages still hanging in the balance, the fate of Palestinian civilians. Look at the displacement that has already occurred in Lebanon, even with this lower grade conflict. So if this were to spiral further out of control, it will only be civilians who pay the price.
You have faced criticism, I think it's fair to say, from even within your own agency, staffers on your team who express a frustration with what they see as a hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy, that the U.S. continues to supply humanitarian aid on a large scale to try to get that into the people of Gaza at the same time that it's supplying Israel with weapons to continue to wage that war. And I know some of your staffers, it's been publicly reported, have asked you about what they see as the Biden administration being complicit in what they see as genocide being waged by Israel in Gaza. And one of the things they point out is the fact that you wrote a book on genocide. They've called on you to speak out or to resign. How do you handle that kind of frustration within your own agency, and what are you telling your staffers?
Well, USAID is an incredibly mission-driven agency where people come to work every day to save lives, to improve lives. It's honestly inspiring to work, including among those people who criticize me. They're incredibly talented people. They could be working in the private sector. Instead, they come to work every day to help people like the people who are suffering in Gaza. More than 40,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza, more than 13,000 children, more than 300 aid workers. I would honestly be disappointed if my staff were not in churn and pressing for more. And I just feel lucky that I'm in the government, in the room, engaging the Israelis, working with the team that's pushing for a ceasefire, because fundamentally that's what's needed most of all, because clearly none of us can be satisfied with where things are now in Gaza.
Do you share any part of their concern that there's a hypocrisy to the U.S. policy there?
I share their focus on the human consequences of everything we do, and that's why we have live debates inside the administration. It's also why President Biden in the General Assembly today just talked about the importance of a ceasefire.
We heard the president also today speak about Sudan and what is now the largest humanitarian crisis on the planet. He recently said that now famine has taken hold in the Darfur region. I know that aid trucks have not been able to reach one of the largest camps for displaced people there, and access there has been blocked by some of the militia forces. What more can the U.S. do? I know you're already providing record levels of aid, but should we be considering airdrops, some other means of getting aid in?
All of the above, but it is really important to say that we cannot humanitarian aid our way out of the kind of widespread famine that is at risk of breaking out across Sudan. You're right, USAID is investing hundreds of millions of dollars in commodities, but many of those trucks are just sitting at checkpoints. And that's just a matter of political will. It's a matter of, do these self-interested generals who clearly care more about themselves than their country, are they willing to put their own interests above even letting trucks get through that could avert famine? And so there are plenty of countries who are providing weapons to those actors who could be exercising their leverage, and that is what the diplomacy is about this week.
We heard the president call for people to stop that supply of weapons into that conflict. Is the U.S. doing enough, in your opinion, to leverage those relationships to stop that flow of weapons in?
Well, every channel that we have to those major players in this conflict, we are using, including this week, in very high-level engagements, including some that I've had myself, certainly those the president, the most important.
And do you feel there's been progress in those talks this week?
We'll see. I mean, there's certainly verbal progress, and we have heard a lot of commitments to peace that are not then followed through with actual termination of weapons supply. But we also have a responsibility, as you said, to think about airlift, airdrop, even if it's more expensive and less efficient, just as with Gaza, we had to take measures like that.
We know that duties and responsibilities of USAID are so vast, and I know just yesterday you made a major announcement when it comes to a particular initiative around eliminating lead in a number of low and middle income countries. A huge increase in funding to about $150 million in partnership with other agencies as well. It was stunning to read that in some places the level of lead exposure for children is more than 10 times the rate of what we were also alarmed to see here in Flint, Michigan. Why is this particular initiative a priority for USAID right now?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for raising it. This is a silent killer globally, kills more than 1.5 million people a year. That's more than HIV and malaria combined. And yet, while we spend billions of dollars, rightly, in combating those diseases, up to this point, we've only spent $15 million a year, and there hasn't been a salience to this issue. Many of the heads of state that I engage and bring what is quite rudimentary data about the 1 in 2 lead poisoning that exists in most developing countries, most of those heads of state are shocked.
That's 1 out of every 2 children in these countries.
1 out of every 2 kids, when it was 1 in 20, as you said, in Flint, Michigan, when we were rightly scandalized by that. So it won't take much to get lead out of paint, lead out of spices, lead out of cosmetics, these consumer products. We did it in advanced economies, but then the playbook stayed here, and it didn't go to developing countries. We can address something that is literally poisoning kids when they go to school, when they pick up their toys, when they eat the food that their mothers prepare, because there might be lead residue in some pots. What a tragedy that this is something we could have solved all these years, but what an opportunity actually to make a huge difference in a short time.
USAID Administrator Samantha Power, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Now some new insights into the caregiving crisis in America. A new report from RAND has found one group is especially struggling, those caring for veterans. Lisa Desjardins has more.
The national survey was commissioned by the nonpartisan Elizabeth Dole Foundation and conducted by the Rand Corporation. They found those caring for military members or veterans are an increasingly large group and stretched increasingly thin. The study estimates more than 14 million Americans are caring for a current or former service member. Even with the Veterans Administration in place, those families spend an average of nearly $9,000 a year out of pocket for care. That as 39% of these caregivers are also raising a child. And those children are helping with at least one caregiving task. Joining me to discuss this is former Secretary of Veterans Affairs and the chairman of the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, Bob McDonald. Now, that figure, 14 million caregivers who have served, that's nearly triple what it was in 2014.
It was a shock to us, Lisa. In 2011, actually, the research began. That original study found 5.5 million caregivers. But the way we asked the question was, it was a very simple, single question: are you a caregiver? This study, the methodology was a little bit different, and we asked the questions of the behaviors of a caregiver. Are you bathing the person you care for? Are you supplying their medications? Are you taking them to doctors? And what we discovered was the real number is, as you said, 14.3 million, and it was shocking to us how big it was. In a way, it wasn't surprising because the population is aging.
There has been some positive news in a sense because more service members are surviving battlefield trauma. But what does that mean on the other end in terms of the mental and physiological care that they need?
Well, that's exactly a great point. You're 10 times more likely to survive the battlefield today than in previous wars. That means that we have more veterans with more grievous injuries, and that's what's requiring the caregiving. The need for caregiving has exploded, and unfortunately, a lot of the last war was injuries that dealt with brain injury, which is, mental health is something we know the least about. And as a result of that, many of these caregivers are dealing with what we call the unseen injuries of war.
Your survey found that many of these families are hitting points of physical and financial exhaustion. I want to hear from one of these caregivers. This is Tracy Brown, whose father was in the Air Force and now has dementia.
Fatigue, I'm going to put that at the top of the list. Also, just being able to continue to live my life and feeling like I totally lost my identity just to be able to care for my dad. And it's really, really difficult not being able to necessarily find reliable care or care that's going to be high quality.
So many of us are thinking about and giving care right now. But what's different for military families, veteran caregivers, than the rest of us who are thinking about aging parents?
Well, many of the people coming through the military who are now needing caregiving have relatively low incomes. Roughly, the RAND study found 130% of the poverty line qualifying for food stamps, or SNAP as we call it, needing financial help.
What about government resources? And I know that the study found it was about 35%, I think, of these caregivers, military and veterans, that are at 130% or below in poverty level.
Right.
Government resources, are there enough, or is it just people aren't connected enough?
It's a trend. When I became secretary in 2014, it was just at the point where Senator Dole and I worked together. We got some legislation passed that provided a stipend to the caregivers. Over time, more and more benefits have been added, such as mental health care for the caregiver. But there's a bill right now that's gone through committee. It's in Congress. It's ready to be passed.
The other part of that question, the tough angle, is that we do have a national debt problem. We have a deficit problem. Veteran care is expensive. We don't care on the front end. We don't prevent. We sort of care on the other end. What would you say to those who say they're concerned about the rise in veterans' costs, even as we're clearly not addressing all of it?
I would argue that on the backs of veterans and veterans' families is probably not the place I would start. We need to take care of our veterans. We're doing everything we can to try to figure out how to make this financially viable. I think, at the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, we use corporate private-public partnerships. We work with the VA, we work with companies that want to help, and as a result, I think the monetary part of it should not be as big of an issue.
Bob McDonald, thank you for an illuminating report.
Thank you, Lisa. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
The murder of Emmett Till is one of the most harrowing events in American history, serving as a catalyst for the civil rights movement. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy from Chicago who in August 1955 traveled to Mississippi to visit relatives. His brutal killing would expose the deep-seated racism and violence faced by Black Americans, especially in the Jim Crow South. The events leading to Till's murder began when a white woman, Carolyn Bryant, accused him of making an inappropriate advance toward her, an alleged brief interaction considered a grievous offense in the racially segregated South of the 1950s. Days later, Bryant's husband, Roy Bryant, and his half-brother, J.W. Milam, abducted Till, brutally tortured and murdered him. They were later tried and acquitted by an all-white jury. Now, best-selling author Wright Thompson travels back to his native Mississippi for a fresh and unflinching account of the conspiring forces behind Till's murder, focusing on the place where it happened. It's called The Barn, The Secret History of a Murder in Mississippi. I spoke with him yesterday. Wright Thompson, thanks so much for being with us.
Man, thank you so much.
Your family farm is about 20 miles from the site of the barn where Emmett Till was beaten and killed, yet you had to leave the state to go to college before you learned anything about it. How did this history reveal itself to you?
You know, it was shocking to me, all the things that personally I didn't know. And then as I started researching the barn where Emmett Till was killed, I realized that most of America actually doesn't know a lot about this. This is a very famous murder, and yet there's been so much erasure, and there's been so many intentional things stripped from the historical record that the book The Barn ends up being the story of this murder, yes, but also of the like long-going process of trying to erase this from memory, and the activists who were fighting to keep that memory alive.
Yeah, well, tell me more about that. The notion that this barn's obscurity reflects this whitewashing, this effort to cover up the horrendous nature of Emmett Till's abduction and murder, and the complicity and the depravity of all of the people who were involved.
Well, you know, one thing I certainly didn't know is that, you know, one of the key drivers of this very famous murder was political rhetoric, for instance. Mississippi in 1955 had a unbelievable governor's race. You know, it was a race to the bottom, frankly. I mean, you go read the things people were saying, and it was just supercharged, violent, metaphorically violent rhetoric. And that election happened on a Tuesday, and Emmett and his cousins and friends went to the Bryant's grocery on Wednesday. And so he was down there in the middle of an incredibly heated political campaign where the only issue that mattered was school segregation and integration. And so I didn't realize until I started researching it what a role that really violent political rhetoric played in this famous murder.
Well, over the years, historians and journalists have pieced together a deeper, more accurate account of what happened to him. What did you discover over the course of writing this book?
I mean, some really harrowing things. I mean, I found out that the murder weapon was in a safety deposit box in a bank in Greenwood, Mississippi. I had Carolyn Bryant's memoir sent to me on a thumb drive where she essentially doubles down and takes her lies to the grave. The sheer tonnage of what we don't know is to me as much a part of the story as the things we do know.
On September 23rd, 1955, an all-white jury in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi, acquitted the two white men who were charged with murdering Emmett Till. And at the trial, 8 of the jurors, a defense attorney, and the sheriff, it turns out, were all from the same extended family as the 2 men on trial, Roy Bryant and J.W. Milam. Help us understand that aspect of this story.
It wasn't 2 random people who killed another random person. I mean, it was a tribe of people killing the child of another tribe of people, which every West Point professor will tell you is an act of war. These were folks who were all from the same very tight-knit community in the hills up above the Mississippi Delta. I mean, one of the jurors' fathers was J.W. Milam's contact when he joined the Army. Like, who's the person who'll always know where you are? So, I mean, this wasn't just a jury of his peers, as they say. This was a jury of people who were part of the same tribe.
You're from the region that you write about in this book. This book is part a meditation on Emmett Till's murder. It's also part memoir. How did unearthing and investigating this story help you reckon with your family's history?
You know, I love that. I think it's the Malcolm X quote that everywhere south of Canada is the South. And so, you know, it was very important to me to learn my own family history, but I also think it's very important for all Americans to read about this square of land around the barn where Emmett Till was killed and think about their own square of land. And, you know, I think that the project of continuing the American experiment feels to me rooted in the idea that we first have to agree on a common history. And I hope that this book is a tiny pebble in the lake of that and sends out some ripples. But that investigation, reckoning, interrogation, whatever the verb you want to use, is absolutely essential to this project.
Wright Thompson, the book is The Barn, The Secret History of a Murder in Mississippi. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much, Jeff.
One of rock and roll's greatest songwriters is out with a brand new album. It's Nick Lowe's first full-length effort in nearly a dozen years, and it debuted at #1 on the Billboard charts in the Americana Folk category. Special correspondent Tom Casciato has the story for our Arts and Culture series, Canvas.
I'll be long gone, Daddy.
It's hard to find rock and roll credentials more solid than Nick Lowe's.
I'll be long gone, Daddy, when you find my note.
And it's not just because he tours with a surf rock band, Los Straitjackets in their trademark Mexican wrestling masks. From pub rock to new wave, he built his rep in the 70s, solo and in the bands Brinsley Schwartz and Rockpile. He was also a producer for Graham Parker, The Damned, and Elvis Costello. He even penned one of rock's most memorable anthems, made famous by Costello. But if rock and roll is all you know about Nick Lowe and his 75 years on the planet, and well over 50 in the music business, well, let's start at the start.
My father was a career RAF officer. He was a pilot. He met my mum during the war. She was in the Women's Royal Air Force. She came from a show business family, sort of vaudeville, really. She was a very good singer and taught me how to sing Inchworm from the Hans Christian Andersen, Danny Kaye thing. Inchworm, Inchworm. And that's got this lovely descant when the kids sing one tune and there's a counter melody. You and your... I figured out how to be able to sing another tune while somebody is singing a different tune. And a third element is created. And I kept on bugging her to do it again. I go, come on, Mum, let's do the Inchworm song.
He recalls more seeds his mother planted. The country of Tennessee Ernie Ford.
Fatback, Louisiana, USA.
The jazzy pop of Nat King Cole.
Sunny gets blue. You know, Sinatra, Peggy Lee, pre-Beatles era music, which I loved.
But then came the Beatles, and scenes like this led young Nick straight to rock and roll.
You know, I wanted to be famous on the TV, meet more girls, you know, that way. That was my main ambition at the time. Well, it didn't take me too long to realize that if I wanted to have any kind of long career, I had to learn how to write songs.
So a composer he became, writing songs he still performs today.
What's going on?
But as he gained confidence, he also learned humility, as when he produced Costello's classic debut album.
I started the record with Elvis saying, "Right, Elvis, so I think what you should do here is this, that, and don't sing there." And then after about 2 days, I was turning up at the studio saying, "Good morning, Mr. Costello. What would you like to do today?"
In 1979, Nick Lowe established hitmaker status on his own. A British documentary from the era shows him looking very much a rock star. But he says that involved a certain amount of role play.
I realized pretty soon that I wasn't the sort of person that could sustain that.
So you didn't think rock superstardom sure to fall?
No. I'm not an Elton John or a Cher, and I've always thought that the most fun you can have is just before you make it.
In the 80s, just after he'd made it, it sure looked like Nick was having fun. Maybe the time of his life.
You watch the videos and you look like you're on top of the world.
Yes, I suppose it did, but I thought that was me in decline. I could feel my pop star status waning. I was drinking and taking too many drugs in a bid to try and cheer myself up and write better songs. And it doesn't work, boys and girls. But also my pop star shtick was boring me as well.
It sounds like it was hard for a time for Nick Lowe to be Nick Lowe.
Paint is peeling. There's cracks in the ceiling.
But in the ensuing decades, he abandoned the rock star stance and took on the role he has to this day, that of what Rolling Stone has called a master songwriter who never takes himself too seriously.
You are, Britain's songwriter, right? I mean,
I think that Paul McCartney might have something to say about that. But
he gained that status partly by reaching back to the music he learned from his mum.
I'll send a van to get my stuff.
A lot of the music you've recorded from the 90s on, I think, has as much of a relationship to that pre-Beatles era as to the rock era.
Yes, well, that's nice of you to have observed that.
Nick and the band have a new album, Indoor Safari, in which they've re-recorded some of his favorite compositions of recent vintage.
Trombone, come play your song.
And he still strikes a good pose, though he's got a few things to say to the kid who wanted to be a star.
If Nick in 2024 could talk to Nick in 1974, is there something you know now that you wish you knew then?
Well, Johnny Cash once said to me, incredibly disappointingly, I thought at the time, "Nick, what you've got to do is figure out how to be yourself." I didn't really know what he meant. I thought, is that the best you can do, John? But actually, now I do. Because when you're young, you're trying to sort of cop an act. You're trying to be, always trying to be somebody that you're not. And you've got to sort of welcome in the things that you don't really like about yourself, but welcome it in. Because if you can figure out how to be yourself, it makes things so much easier.
What's so funny about peace, love, and understanding?
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Tom Casciato in Tarrytown, New York.
So funny about peace, love, and understanding. You gotta be cruel to be kind in the right measure. Cruel to be kind, that's a very good sign. Cruel to be kind means that I love you.
A news update before we go. The man suspected of trying to kill former President Donald Trump at his Florida golf course has been charged with attempting to assassinate a major presidential candidate. Ryan Ruth allegedly aimed a rifle through shrubbery at the West Palm Beach golf course while Mr. Trump was playing on it. He was initially charged with 2 federal gun offenses. The upgraded charges come after prosecutors said earlier this week that the suspect left a note describing his intentions. Well, later this evening on PBS, Frontline presents the latest installment of The Choice. The film takes a closer look at the lives of Kamala Harris and Donald Trump as they seek the presidency, drawing on insights from those who know both candidates and revealing key moments that could shape how each would lead the country if elected. The Choice premieres on PBS and streams on YouTube at 9 p.m. Eastern. Check your local listings. And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Jeff Bennett. For all of us here at the PBS NewsHour, thanks for spending part of your evening with us.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
Consumer Cellular, this is Sam. How may I help you? This is a pocket dial. Well, somebody's pocket. Thought I'd let you know that with Consumer Cellular, you get nationwide coverage with no contract. That's kind of our thing. Have a nice day.
I absolutely love my job because I love the people I work with. Everyone is trying to connect on a personal level.
We look out for one another. We love to see our teammates thrive.
You don't have to change how you walk. You don't have to change how you talk.
We can bring our authentic selves to work and do our best stuff. That's joy.
Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.